In the Old West, a gang of ruthless outlaws took on a job for a fortune in gold: hunt down the beast terrorizing a remote town. They thought it was just another animal. They were wrong. The real terror began when they realized the beast was hunting them back. The dust tasted like copper. Jedediah Kane kept his head low, the splintered wood of the water trough digging into his cheek. Across the deserted street, Sheriff Miller had his men spread thin, their rifles glinting in the unforgiving sun. A bead of sweat traced a path through the grime on Jed's temple. He could hear Cody's ragged breathing from the livery stable and Silas's low, steady hum, a nervous habit he'd had for 20 years. Doc, as usual, was silent, a ghost behind the saloon's swinging doors. "You're boxed in, Kane." Miller's voice was reedy, stretched thin by fear. "There's no way out. Just throw down the guns in the strongbox." Jed didn't move. He counted them again, 6 men, amateurs. They were bunched up, thinking numbers meant strength. He, on the other hand, had a team. He risked a glance to his left. Cody was young, all fire and speed, his knuckles white on the grip of his Colt. To his right, Silas was the Rock, a man who'd seen 100 towns just like this one and knew how they ended. And Doc was the punctuation at the end of the sentence. "Last chance, Jed." Jed raised his voice, making it sound strained, desperate. "Just let us ride out, Miller. You can have the bank's money. We just want to get out of here with our lives." A nervous chuckle from the posse. They thought they had him. That was the first mistake. Jed's mind was a cold machine, clicking through possibilities. His gaze settled on the hotel balcony above the sheriff's head. The support post was old, bleached by the sun. "Cody," Jed whispered, his voice barely a rustle in the wind. "The balcony post, not the man, the post." Cody's grin was a flash of white in the shadows. "Easy." "Silas," Jed continued, "when it falls, you give them hell from the right. Keep their heads down." A grunt of assent. "Doc," Jed said, raising his voice slightly, "the sound of Silas's rifle is your cue." A single, almost imperceptible nod from the saloon. "It's over, Kane," the sheriff shouted, taking a bold step forward. Jed finally rose, his hands held high and empty. He looked defeated. "All right, Miller, you win." He took a slow step into the open, drawing every eye. It was all the misdirection they needed. The crack of Cody's rifle was sharp and precise. Not the dull boom of a shot meant for a man, but the high-pitched crack of lead hitting wood. The balcony post exploded in a shower of splinters. The whole structure groaned, sagged, and then collapsed with a deafening crash, raining timber and dust down on the sheriff and his men. Panic erupted. Before the first splinter hit the ground, Silas opened up from the right, his repeater spitting fire and forcing the posse to dive for cover. In that moment of chaos, Doc stepped out from the saloon, not with a pistol, but with a single stick of dynamite. The fuse was already lit. He didn't throw it at the men. He lobbed it under the town's only fire wagon. The explosion wasn't large, but it was brutally effective. The wagon leaped into the air, its bell clanging a frantic, useless alarm before it crashed down in a wreck of shattered wood and twisted metal. It was a statement. "We can destroy you." The posse's nerve broke. They scrambled, some firing blindly, others simply running. Jed never even drew his weapon. He walked calmly to his horse, grabbed the reins, and watched his men emerge from their positions, the heavy strongbox between them. They mounted up and trotted out of town, leaving behind the dust, the fear, and the wreckage. They didn't look back. There was no whooping, no celebration. It was just a job. A dead man's gold was now theirs, and the only thing that mattered was the weight of it in their saddlebags. The town of Redemption was a whole. The saloon smelled of stale beer and desperation, a perfect place for men like them to become invisible. They'd been there 2 days, letting the heat from the last job die down, turning their gold into whiskey and warm meals. Silas was cleaning his repeater at their corner table, his movements slow and methodical. Cody was trying to impress a weary-looking saloon girl, while Doc stared into his beer as if it held the secrets of the universe. Jed was counting. Not the money. He already knew that to the dollar. He was counting the exits. That's when he saw him. The man stood in the doorway, blinking against the gloom. He was soft, his suit too clean for a place like this, his face pale with a fear that was old and deep. He scanned the room, his eyes passing over the drunks and the gamblers, finally settling on their table. He knew who he was looking for. The man approached, his steps hesitant. "Jedediah Kane?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper. Jed didn't answer. He just stared, letting the silence do the work. "My name is Thorne," the man said, wringing his hands. "Mayor Thorne, of Silver Creek." Cody laughed. "Silver Creek? Never heard of it. Is that a town or a threat?" "It's a town," Thorne said, ignoring Cody. "A good town, or it was." He pulled a chair over uninvited and sat down. He leaned in, his voice dropping lower. "I need to hire you, all of you. I was told you were the best, that you're efficient." "Efficient costs money," Jed said, his voice flat. "I have money," Thorne said quickly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, placing it on the table. He loosened the drawstring and the soft, heavy glow of gold coins spilled out. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a down payment. A promise. $500 now, another 4,000, 500 upon completion of the job. Silas stopped cleaning his rifle. Even Cody stopped his flirting. $5,000. That was a king's ransom. It was enough to disappear, to start over, to buy a piece of the world. "What kind of job pays $5,000? Silas asked, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I need you to hunt something," Thorne said, his gaze flickering nervously around the room. "A predator. It's been taking livestock now. It's taken people, prospectors from the hills." "A wolf? A bear?" Jed asked, unimpressed. "That's a job for a tracker, not for us." "This is no ordinary animal," Thorne insisted, his voice trembling slightly. "It's big, vicious. The men I sent after it, they didn't come back. The town is paralyzed. No one goes out after dark. We are prisoners in our own homes. I need men who aren't afraid of a fight. Men who will do what needs to be done." Jed studied the mayor's face. He saw the desperation, but he also saw something else, something hidden behind the eyes. The man was holding something back. "Too much money for a simple beast," Silas muttered, shaking his head. "Smells like bad luck, Jed." Jed heard him. He felt the same cold knot of suspicion in his gut, but he also saw the gold. He saw the number, $5,000. It was a number that could erase a lot of bad luck. It could buy a hell of a lot of silence. His cynicism was a shield, but his greed was a weapon, and it was pointed squarely at the mayor's offer. He looked at his men. Cody's eyes were wide with excitement. Doc was inscrutable as ever. Silas was wary, but he would follow Jed's lead. It was Jed's call. The risk was a shadow, but the reward was a blazing sun. Jed pushed the pouch of gold back towards the mayor. "Keep your down payment," he said. "We get paid when the job is done, all of it." A wave of relief washed over Thorne's face. "Thank you. God, thank you." "Don't thank God," Jed said, his voice cold as iron. "He's not the one taking your job." They rode out at dawn the next day, Mayor Thorne leading them on a fresh horse. The open plains felt familiar, the sun warm on their backs. For the first day, the mood was light. Cody boasted about how he'd spend his share, while Jed and Silas rode in a comfortable silence, the promise of the gold a silent understanding between them. But as the sun set on the second day, the landscape began to change. The flat earth buckled and rose, giving way to rolling hills covered in dense, dark woods. The trail narrowed, and the trees grew closer together, their branches like clawing fingers reaching for them. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. By the third day, they were deep in the mountains. The trail was a treacherous ribbon of rock and dirt clinging to the side of steep slopes. The sky seemed to shrink, trapped between jagged peaks that tore at the clouds. A constant low wind whispered through the pines, a mournful sound that set the horses on edge. They grew skittish, their ears twitching at every snap of a twig. "Not much farther," Thorne called out, though his voice lacked conviction. He seemed to shrink with every mile, his fine suit now covered in dust, his face etched with a tension that went beyond the difficult ride. That's when Silas reined in his horse, his eyes fixed on a tree beside the trail. "Jed, look at this." Jed rode up beside him. Carved deep into the bark of an ancient pine was a symbol, a circle with a jagged line struck through it. It was crude but deliberate. "What is it?" Cody asked, pulling up behind them. "An old ward," Silas said, his voice low. "A warning. To keep things out, or in." Thorne shifted nervously in his saddle. "Just local superstition, means nothing." But as they rode on, they saw more of them, scratched onto rocks, carved into trees, painted on the door of a dilapidated shack they passed. The symbols were everywhere, like a silent, screaming warning they couldn't understand. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, a palpable pressure on the back of their necks. This wasn't just wilderness, it was hostile territory. Late in the afternoon, they crested a high ridge. Thorne pointed a trembling finger. "There," he said. "Silver Creek." The town was nestled in a deep, shadowed valley below, but it wasn't a welcoming sight. From this distance, it looked wrong, like a wound on the landscape. A pall of smoke hung over it, but not from cheerful hearths. It was thin and gray, the smoke of fires that had been left to die. No lights twinkled in the dusk, no sounds drifted up to them. The whole valley was cloaked in an unnatural silence. Jed stared down at Silver Creek, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. Silas had been right. This place smelled of bad luck. It smelled of death. And they were riding straight into its heart. Riding into Silver Creek was like entering a graveyard. The silence they'd felt from the ridge was a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. The clop of their own horses' hooves was an intrusion. Every building was shuttered, the windows dark and lifeless voids. The same strange symbol was painted on nearly every door, a desperate ward against the encroaching night. A man appeared from an alleyway, his face a mask of gaunt fear. He carried a rifle like it was a part of him. "Thorne, you brought them?" "I did, Sheriff," the mayor said, his voice thin. "This is Jedediah Kane and his men." The sheriff's eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, swept over them. There was no welcome in his gaze, only a bitter mix of hatred and desperation. "Outlaws," he spat. "This is what we've come to, hiring devils to fight a demon." "We're your only hope," Jed said, his voice level. He wasn't here to make friends. From the door of the town's small church, another figure emerged. A priest, his black cassock dusted with grime, clutched a heavy wooden cross. "You bring guns," he said, his voice shaking with a fervor that bordered on madness. "Guns will not harm this creature. It is a punishment from God, a demonic presence sent to cleanse us of our sins." Cody let out a short, sharp laugh. "A demon, Padre? We've dealt with plenty of those. They all bleed the same." The priest flinched as if struck. "You mock what you do not understand. Tonight is the third night of the full moon. It will be at its strongest. You are walking into hell itself." Jed ignored him, turning back to the sheriff. "Where were the last attacks?" "The old prospecting camps in the woods to the east," the sheriff said, pointing a thumb towards the darkening forest that loomed over the town. "But it's been getting bolder, closer." "Then that's where we'll start," Jed said, dismounting. He looked at his men. Their earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a tense professional focus. The fear in this town was a physical thing, so thick you could taste it, but fear was a tool, and they were here to work. They checked their rifles, loaded their pistols, and grabbed extra ammunition from their saddlebags. The townsfolk were pathetic, lost in their superstitions, but whatever had them this scared was real. As the last sliver of sun vanished behind the jagged peaks, casting the valley into deep shadow, Jed and his men walked towards the edge of town. The townsfolk who watched from behind their boarded windows saw 4 dark figures moving with grim purpose, silhouetted against the forbidding woods. They looked less like saviors and more like ghosts, already claimed by the darkness they were about to enter. The hunt had begun. The forest swallowed the last of the light. A thick canopy of pine blocked out the rising moon, plunging them into a world of shadow and sound. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, was magnified in the suffocating quiet. Jed led the way, his eyes scanning the ground, while Silas and Cody covered the flanks, their rifles at the ready. Doc trailed behind, a silent shadow. They found the first sign within a quarter mile, a set of tracks pressed deep into the damp earth. "Wolf," Cody whispered, kneeling down for a closer look. "A big one." Jed knelt beside him. The tracks were huge, the paw prints larger than his fist. They followed them, moving deeper into the woods. The trail was easy to read, the creature's weight leaving a clear path. But then something changed. "Jed," Silas called out, his voice tight. He was pointing his rifle barrel at the ground 50 feet ahead. "The tracks." Jed moved forward, his lantern held high. The wolf tracks continued for another 20 feet, and then they just stopped. In their place, a new set of prints began. They were longer, narrower, and unmistakably bipedal. It was as if a wolf had suddenly stood up and started walking like a man. "What in God's name?" Cody breathed. Jed felt a cold spike of unease. He ran his fingers over the edge of the new print. It was deep, showing immense weight. He tried to piece it together, to find a logical explanation. A man walking in moccasins? A prank? But the transition was seamless. There was no sign of a person changing footwear, no scuffed earth. It was impossible. A foul smell hit them then, the coppery stench of old blood. They followed it to a small clearing. The scene there turned their stomachs. A full-grown deer had been thrown 30 feet into the air, its body impaled on the broken branches of a thick pine tree. Below it, on the ground, was the source of the bipedal tracks, the remains of a prospector. He hadn't just been killed, he'd been torn apart, his limbs scattered around the clearing like a child's discarded doll. The sheer, savage violence was beyond anything a known animal could inflict. Cody gagged and turned away. Even Silas, who had seen the worst of the war, looked pale. Jed's mind raced, his cynical pragmatism fighting against the horrifying evidence before him. This wasn't a wolf, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man. It was something else, something that hunted on 4 legs and killed on 2. "It's a monster," Cody stammered, his bravado completely gone. "Every monster has a weakness," Jed said, his voice harder than he felt. The fear was a cold snake coiling in his gut, but he couldn't show it. Not now. "It's clever, but it's an animal, and animals can be trapped." He scanned the area, his hunter's instincts taking over. A narrow canyon lay a few hundred yards to the north. A perfect bottleneck. "We'll funnel it," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "We'll build a deadfall, line the path with tripwires and snares. Whatever this thing is, we'll make it bleed. We'll put it in the ground." They worked with a grim, silent efficiency, their fear channeled into the labor. They felled a tree, rigged the ropes, and set their snares, their confidence slowly returning with each familiar task. They were still the predators here. They were in control. But as they settled into their positions, hidden amongst the rocks overlooking the canyon, the full moon began to rise, bathing the unnatural landscape in a sickly silver light. And from deep within the canyon they heard a man begin to scream. The scream was high and terrified, echoing off the canyon walls. It wasn't the roar of a beast, but the desperate cry of a man. "It's a trap," Silas hissed, his rifle aimed down into the ravine. "Or bait," Jed countered. "The creatures cornered him down there." "We have to help him," Cody insisted, his youthful impulsiveness overriding his fear. Jed hesitated for only a second. The bounty was for killing a predator, not rescuing fools who wandered into its path. But the scream was raw, human. "Stay sharp," he ordered, and they began to pick their way down the steep incline, moving towards the sound. They found him near the canyon floor, a grizzled prospector, his leg caught in a steel bear trap. One of their own. He must have stumbled right into it. He was thrashing, his eyes wide with a terror that was aimed not at them, but at the shadows around him. "Help me!" he shrieked, clawing at the trap. It's coming back for me!" Jed motioned for Doc to disable the trap while he and the others scanned the darkness, their rifles ready. The full moon crested the top of the canyon, flooding the narrow space with brilliant ethereal light. And in that light, the prospector began to change. It started with a tremor, a violent shudder that racked his entire body. He let out a guttural groan that was no longer entirely human. His fingers spasmed, the nails thickening and yellowing into claws. A sickening crack echoed through the canyon as his bones began to snap and elongate, rearranging themselves under his skin. His spine arched, his clothes ripping as his torso swelled with unnatural muscle. Coarse, dark fur sprouted from his flesh, and his face pushed forward into a snarling, bestial muzzle, his teeth lengthening into fangs. They could only watch, frozen in disbelief and horror. The man was gone. In his place stood a monster, a 9-foot-tall nightmare of muscle and fur, its eyes glowing with a malevolent yellow light. It was a werewolf. The priest's ravings, the town's fear, the impossible tracks, it all crashed down on them with horrifying clarity. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound of pure rage and power. It looked down at the bear trap still clamped on its now massive furred leg, and with a casual flex of muscle, it shattered the thick steel. Time seemed to slow down. Cody, recovering first, raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the beast in the chest, barely making it flinch. It turned its glowing eyes on him, a look of intelligent fury in their depths. Before anyone else could react, the werewolf lunged. It crossed the 20 feet between them in a single, impossible bound. It didn't just attack Cody, it eviscerated him. A single swipe of its claws tore through him, and he was thrown back against the canyon wall, a broken ruin. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Jed and Silas emptied their rifles into the creature's massive form. The bullets hit, tearing through fur and flesh, but it was like throwing stones at a mountain. The beast roared in fury, its wounds steaming in the cold night air as they began to close. It took another step towards them, ready to finish the job. Then, for a reason they couldn't fathom, it paused. It sniffed the air, turned, and leaped up the sheer rock face of the canyon, disappearing over the edge in a matter of seconds. Silence fell, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Jed stared at Cody's body, then at the spot where the monster had been. The $5,000 in gold felt like a pittance, a fool's price for a ticket to hell. The job wasn't just a bust. Their entire world had just been torn apart. The hunters had become the hunted. Panic was a tangible thing, a cold fire that threatened to consume them. Jed's first instinct was to run, to get to the horses and ride until the sun came up, leaving Silver Creek and its curse behind. He grabbed Silas and Doc, and they scrambled out of the canyon, not daring to look back at what was left of Cody. But the forest that had felt oppressive before now felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to hold the creature. Every gust of wind sounded like its breathing. They ran, crashing through underbrush, their only thought to get back to the relative safety of the town. That's when they realized they were being herded. A howl erupted from the woods to their left, impossibly close. They veered right, only for another howl to answer from that direction, cutting off their path. The beast wasn't just chasing them, it was playing with them. A large boulder crashed down the hillside just ahead of them, dislodged by something powerful moving on the ridge above. It was guiding them, pushing them where it wanted them to go. "It's toying with us," Silas yelled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's enjoying this." Jed knew he was right. The creature's retreat in the canyon wasn't out of fear. It had let them go. It wanted the hunt to continue. Their skills as outlaws, their ability to read the land and predict an enemy's move were useless. Their enemy was faster, stronger, and knew this terrain like the back of its own clawed hand. They broke through the tree line and saw the dark shapes of the town ahead. Hope surged through them, a foolish, desperate hope. They sprinted across the open ground, their boots pounding on the dirt road, making for the most defensible building they could think of, the church. Its stone walls were thick, its doors heavy oak. They burst through the doors, Jed and Silas slamming them shut and dropping the heavy wooden bar into place, just as a massive dark shape blotted out the moonlight behind them. A thunderous impact shook the entire building, the sound of the beast throwing its full weight against the door. Splinters flew from the oak, but it held. They stumbled back, chests heaving, listening to the creature circle the building. They could hear its heavy footsteps, the scrape of its claws on the stone walls. It wasn't roaring now. It was breathing, a low, guttural sound of patient hunger, a deep, terrifying snuffing as it tested the air, searching for a way in. They were trapped. Their guns were next to useless. Their friend was dead. The monster was outside, waiting, and the night was still young. In the terrifying silence of the church, Jed realized the horrifying truth of their situation. They hadn't found shelter. They had just locked themselves in a tomb. The silence was worse than the noise. For long minutes there was nothing but the sound of their own ragged breathing and the thumping of their hearts. They stood in the center of the church, rifles raised, scanning the tall, stained glass windows that lined the walls. Each pane depicted a saint, their faces serene and placid, a stark contrast to the terror that gripped the men below. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, a massive clawed hand smashed through the window depicting St. Francis, shattering the image of the patron saint of animals. The irony was lost on them. Glass rained down onto the pews as the werewolf began to tear at the window frame, ripping away the lead and wood to make the opening larger. "Don't let it in!" Jed yelled, and they opened fire. Bullets tore into the creature's arm and shoulder, but it just roared in fury and continued its assault. It squeezed its massive form through the ruined window, tumbling onto the pews with a crash of splintering wood. Chaos erupted. The church became a shooting gallery from hell. Jed, Silas, and Doc scrambled for cover, firing as they moved. The beast was a whirlwind of claws and teeth, shrugging off bullets as it lunged and swiped, destroying everything in its path. Pews were overturned, the altar was smashed, and holy books were sent flying. Silas, taking cover behind a thick pillar, took careful aim and fired his repeater, the shot slamming into the creature's side. The werewolf roared and spun on him, ignoring Jed and Doc completely. It was a blur of motion, closing the distance before Silas could get another shot off. "Silas!" Jed screamed. But it was too late. The beast swiped him with its massive claws, throwing the old outlaw across the room like a rag doll. Silas hit the stone wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor. Enraged, Jed emptied his pistol into the creature's face at point-blank range. One of the bullets struck its eye, and it howled in agony, a high-pitched shriek of pure pain. It staggered back, shaking its massive head, blood and a thick, viscous fluid pouring from the ruined socket. It looked at Jed, its one good eye burning with a hateful intelligence, and then, with a final, frustrated roar, it turned and leaped back out the shattered window, disappearing into the night. Jed rushed to Silas's side. The old man was dying, his chest a ruin. He coughed, a spray of blood speckling Jed's face. "Jed," Silas rasped, his hand fumbling inside his coat. "It's not just a beast. It's a curse." His fingers closed around a small object. He pressed it into Jed's hand. It was a small, tarnished silver locket, the kind a man might carry a picture of a loved one in. "Silver, Jed," Silas whispered, his voice fading. "My mother always said, only silver can kill the devil." His eyes glazed over and the last breath rattled out of him. Jed knelt there, the church a ruin around him, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. He was holding a cheap silver locket, the body of his oldest friend at his feet, and the knowledge that the monster was still out there, wounded and enraged. Everything was lost. Hope was a dead word in a language he no longer spoke. The silence that followed was heavier than any stone. Jed stayed kneeling beside Silas for a long time, the silver locket cold and heavy in his palm. He could feel Doc's presence behind him, a quiet, steady monument in the wreckage. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by a hollow emptiness. His mind, usually a sharp calculating machine, was a fog of failure. The gold was a joke. His guns, the tools of his trade, were nothing more than noisemakers. His crew, the only thing close to a family he'd ever had, was gone. Cody's youthful fire extinguished. Silas's weary wisdom silenced forever. His cynicism, the armor he had worn his whole life, had proven to be as useless as paper against a storm. It had protected him from sentiment, but it had left him blind to real danger. He looked up at the shattered stained glass window. The moon shone through the jagged hole, its light falling on the few terrified townsfolk who had been hiding in the cellar. The sheriff, the priest, a few others. They stared at him, their faces a mixture of terror and a strange, nascent hope. They were looking at him as if he had an answer. His gaze dropped back to the locket in his hand. Silver. The word echoed in his mind, Silas's last desperate gasp. He thought of the priest's wild talk of demons, the town's superstitious wards, and then another piece clicked into place, so obvious he couldn't believe he'd missed it. Silver Creek, the name of the town. It wasn't just a name, it had to mean something. He looked at the priest, a new light in his eyes. The town's name, Jed said, his voice a hoarse rasp. It's not just a name, is it? The priest, Father Michael, crept forward, his eyes wide. Our founders discovered a rich vein of it in the mountain a century ago. It is the reason this town exists. The mine has been abandoned for 50 years, but the town was born from silver. Jed's mind began to work again, the fog clearing, replaced by the cold, sharp focus he was known for. Not for greed, not anymore. This was for survival, for vengeance. Is there a smelter? Jed asked, his voice sharp. A furnace? Where they used to melt the ore? The sheriff nodded slowly. At the old mine entrance east of town. It's a ruin now, hasn't been fired up in decades. Jed stood up, his body aching, his soul weary, but his purpose clear. He held up the small silver locket. This tiny piece of metal was worth more than all the gold in Thorne's strongbox. It was the key. He looked at the faces in the shadows, the sheriff, the priest, Doc. He was no longer a cynical outlaw looking for a payday. He was a survivor. And he had a new plan, a terrible, desperate, insane plan. Then that's where we're going, Jed said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that had nothing to do with money. If we can't kill the devil with bullets, we'll send it back to hell in a river of fire. The church cellar was cramped and smelled of damp earth and fear. By the flickering light of a single lantern, Jed laid out his plan. His audience was a grim collection of the town's last hopes, the weary sheriff, the haunted priest, and Doc, who stood by the door, a silent sentinel. The creature is smart, Jed began, his voice low and intense. It's a hunter. It expects us to cower here until morning. We're going to do the last thing it expects. We're going on the attack. The sheriff shook his head. That's suicide. It'll pick us off one by one in the dark. It will if we fight it on its terms, Jed countered. He pointed a finger at the priest. Father, the old records, the smelter. Is there fuel, coal, anything left to burn? The priest's eyes lit with a flicker of understanding. Yes, the coal sheds should still be full. They were abandoned in a hurry. And the crucible, it's cast iron, it should still be sound. Jed's gaze shifted to Doc. Can you get a fire hot enough to melt silver? For the first time, Doc spoke, his voice a gravelly whisper. With enough coal and a good bellows, I can melt the devil's teeth. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. They would make a run for the abandoned silver mine. While Doc and the sheriff worked to fire up the ancient smelter, Jed would be the bait. He would lure the wounded, enraged werewolf through the town and into the mine, leading it on a chase that had to end directly under the crucible. You'll never make it, the sheriff said, his voice flat with despair. It's too fast, too strong. I don't have to outrun it forever, Jed said, a grim set to his jaw. I just have to outsmart it long enough for them to get the furnace ready. He looked around at the small group. We'll need every silver object in this town. Candlesticks, cutlery, coins, crosses, anything. We're going to melt down this town's soul and pour it on the monster's head. For a long moment, nobody moved. The plan was a thread of hope woven from madness and desperation. It was a prayer offered up to a god of fire and vengeance. Then, the sheriff slowly unpinned the silver star from his chest and placed it on the table. The priest removed a heavy silver cross from his neck and laid it beside the star. One by one, the other survivors emerged from the shadows, adding their meager silver possessions to the pile. A silver-backed hairbrush, a set of spoons, a handful of old coins. It wasn't much, but it was everything they had. They gathered their makeshift tools, shovels for the coal, oil for the bellows, and every lantern they could find. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the church, the air grew thick with a silent tension. They were about to step out into the monster's hunting ground, armed with little more than a desperate plan. The final act was about to begin. Stepping out of the church was like plunging into a cold, dark sea. The moon was high and bright, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move and writhe. Every gust of wind sounded like the creature's breath. The plan was in motion. The sheriff and Father Michael, carrying the town's collected silver, ran first, cutting through the back alleys towards the mine. Jed, Doc, and a handful of other men went the other way, their job a simple, suicidal one: make noise. They fired their guns into the air, yelled into the night, and kicked over barrels, creating a cacophony designed to draw the beast's attention. It worked. A chilling howl tore through the night, closer than they expected. It came from the west, from the direction of the rooftops. The hunt was on. "Go, get to the mine," Jed yelled at the others. "Doc, with me!" They split up, the small group of townsmen scattering, hoping to divide the creature's attention. But the werewolf wasn't interested in them. It wanted the ones who had heard it. A dark shape leaped from one roof to another, a monstrous silhouette against the moon. It landed on the street ahead of Jed and Doc with a ground-shaking thud. Its one good eye burned with cold fire, fixed on them. "This way," Jed shouted, and they ducked into a narrow alleyway, the beast hot on their heels. It was a terrifying chase through the ghost town's maze. They scrambled over fallen carts, crashed through the doors of abandoned homes, and used every bit of their cunning to stay one step ahead. The monster was a force of nature, smashing through walls and obstacles as if they were paper. They were nearing the edge of town when they found their path blocked by a collapsed building. It was a dead end. The werewolf skidded to a halt at the entrance to the alley, trapping them. It lowered its head, a low growl rumbling in its chest, savoring the moment. It was then that Doc, who had been quiet the entire time, shoved Jed towards a small gap in the rubble. "Go," he rasped. "Finish it." Before Jed could protest, Doc turned to face the monster. He held up his hands, and Jed saw what he was holding: 2 sticks of dynamite with impossibly short fuses. "Hey, devil," Doc yelled, a wild, defiant grin on his face. "Let's see you walk this off." He ran straight at the werewolf. The beast, surprised by the sudden charge, swiped at him. But Doc was too close. The dynamite exploded in a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar that shook the entire town. The force of the blast threw Jed through the gap in the rubble, shielding him from the worst of it. When he looked back, the alley was gone. The werewolf was gone, and Doc was gone. There was only a smoking crater. Jed didn't wait. He didn't have time for grief. Doc had bought him his chance. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran for the dark maw of the mine entrance, where he could see the faint, hellish orange glow of a furnace being brought back to life. He could hear a furious, wounded roar echoing from the wreckage behind him. The beast was still alive, and it was coming. Jed burst into the cavernous space of the abandoned mine, the air thick with heat and the smell of burning coal. The old smelter was a monster in its own right, a towering structure of brick and iron. At its base, the sheriff was frantically working a huge leather bellows, feeding air to the furnace. The fire inside roared, casting a demonic glow on the walls. Father Michael stood near the top of the structure, ready to release the crucible. "It's coming," Jed yelled, his voice hoarse. "How much longer?" "Almost there," the sheriff shouted back over the roar. "The silver is melting. Just buy us a little more time." As if on cue, a horrifying shape appeared in the mine entrance, silhouetted against the moonlight. The werewolf was a wreck. Half its face was a mess of burned flesh, its fur was singed, and it moved with a pronounced limp. But it was still alive. And its one good eye was locked on Jed with an unholy intensity. This was no longer a hunt. It was a personal vendetta. The final battle began. It wasn't a fight of strength. Jed would have lost that in a second. It was a battle of wits. He used the mine's labyrinthine layout to his advantage, ducking behind old ore carts and weaving through the maze of decaying support beams. The beast, blinded by rage, smashed through obstacles, its fury making it predictable. Jed scrambled up a rickety ladder to a higher level, the werewolf climbing right behind him, its claws digging deep into the wood. He kicked a pile of loose rocks down at it, making it roar in frustration. He was leading it on a deadly chase, circling closer and closer to the smelter. He leaped across a chasm to a wooden platform directly beneath the crucible. It was the kill zone. The werewolf, seeing him cornered, gathered itself and made a tremendous leap, landing on the platform with a crash that sent the whole structure groaning in protest. It stalked towards him, the final moment at hand. There was nowhere left to run. "Now!" Jed screamed, diving to the side. Above them, Father Michael slammed a hammer against a rusty lever. With a tortured screech of metal, the crucible tilted. A river of incandescent molten silver shimmering like liquid moonlight poured down from above. The werewolf looked up just as the torrent hit it. It didn't have time to scream. The molten silver enveloped it, clinging to its fur and flesh. For a horrifying instant, its shape was preserved, a statue of pure agony before it simply dissolved in a cloud of black smoke and a sound that would haunt Jed's nightmares forever. The burning silver splashed across the platform, setting the old wood ablaze. Jed scrambled away, his clothes smoldering as the fire spread. He, the sheriff, and the priest stumbled out of the mine entrance just as the sun's first rays crested the mountain peaks, chasing the last of the night away. They stood there in the quiet dawn, three exhausted survivors in a world that felt brand new. The town was a wreck, their friends were dead, but the monster was gone. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Mayor Thorne approached them, his face pale but relieved. He held out 2 heavy sacks of gold. "The deal was $5,000, he said. "You've earned it." Jed looked at the sacks of gold, the source of all this death and terror. He thought of Cody's easy laugh, Silas's quiet wisdom, and Doc's final explosive defiance. He reached into one of the sacks and pulled out a single, newly minted silver dollar, its surface still warm. "This is for my men," he said, his voice quiet. He let the coin drop into his pocket. He turned away from the gold, leaving the fortune lying in the dust. He walked to his horse, the lone survivor of Jedediah's desperados, and mounted up. He didn't look back at the town or the money. He just rode west, towards the rising sun, no longer a cynical outlaw chasing a bounty, but a haunted man who had stared into the very heart of hell and somehow had ridden out the other side.